Hi everybody, thank you for joining us. Sorry we're starting a little bit late. I know it's been a long day, but I really appreciate all of your participation. I'm very pleased to now lead this panel with a group of amazing experts. My name is John Lloyd. I'm the Director of Advocacy at the Digital Public Goods Alliance, and I'm also the Program Director for 50 and 5. And with me today, I've got Kamya Chandra, who's the Chief Strategy Officer at the Center for DPI. Got Rene Mendoza, who's Assistant National Statistician of the Philippine Statistics Authority. I've got Yodahe Zemichael, from Executive Director of Ethiopia's National ID System. And last but not least, I've Jasper Sembie, who's the Chief Operating Officer for DSTI Sierra Leone. So thank you very much. This session is part of the 50 and 5, which is a country-led advocacy campaign. We want 50 countries in 5 years to implement safe and inclusive DPI. It's all about sharing lessons and best practices, speeding up learning and adoption journeys. And if you want to get involved in 50 and 5, come and have a chat to me after the panel over the drinks. So procurement. It's often one of the first steps, but can be one of the biggest hurdles and barriers to implementation of DPI. And so we'll just kind of kicking off here. So Rene, when you're implementing PhilSys, which is your MOSIP implementation, I understand that procuring this could have been a bit of a challenge, but you entered something in your terms of reference. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about your experience there.
Okay. All right. So yeah, I think from the Philippine perspective, we were one of maybe the first country to actually adopt MOSIP and procure it. And how we did that is that, well, two things, I think. One, we included in our terms of reference a very specific word, and that is MOSIP. And we said, okay, any bidder who's going to bid here, they need to propose a solution that is based on MOSIP. And so that was the biggest criteria that any bidder had to follow. If we didn't see any of their proposals, that any mention of MOSIP, they're literally going to be disqualified. So, but also we were also, but there's a caveat there, because in our procurement law, and I'm not a procurement specialist, there's a specific clause in our procurement law that says there should be no mention of any proprietary or brand name. For perhaps maybe we can ask the legal experts here, how is MOSIP actually considered? Is it a brand, a certain brand, much like HP or Samsung, or is it like in our case just a preference of a certain software which a bidder should be able to propose in our solution? But thankfully nobody questioned it, and so yeah, the procurement went through. I think, and then the other ingredient, I suppose, that maybe learning from that experience, during that time, it was, MOSIP was still very young. And so there weren't a lot of vendors who could really support MOSIP. But, times have changed. There are now certification programs by MOSIP. And and in our case, if you're or in other countries, use cases where they want to adopt MOSIP as well, for that specific case, they can take advantage of that situation. If there are many vendors now who support MOSIP, they can actually put that as a requirement that, hey, you should be MOSIP certified. So then you can be more confident that that bidder went through a program that can truly support you in your journey in implementing MOSIP. But I'm just talking about MOSIP here. This could probably be, adapted for other open source projects, I suppose. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And Yodahe, that's one challenge that we've heard as well about government essentially a government as a large enterprise customer, and they want to know that in 5, 10 years down the line, there's going to be support for for the product. How did you address that when you were implementing your MOSIP iteration?
So now we're talking about long-term support, right? We haven't actually, it's in the back of our mind. It's in the top of our minds. It's in the horizon. So, because right now, so we have a 5-year contract with our systems integrator. The contract expires next year. And so internally, we're now having this discussion, what should we do next? Should we internally maintain MOSIP ourselves? We have a large human complement of technical people who was really set up for that, just in case the Philippine government wants to take over. So we are like the plan B. So that's being considered. The second option is we renew the contract for maintenance. And then the third is we tender for a new procurement. But the bottom line is, so we have many options. We have 3, and I think regardless of whatever we choose, they are all equally possible, probable, and this will, I hope, again extend our continued use of the MOSIP. So maybe in the next 5 years.
Great, thanks, Rene. And Yodahe, yesterday you mentioned a little bit about vendor lock-in in our session here that we're, when we're talking about myth-busting open source. And I think, sort of on that long-term support as well. Is that something that a challenge that you need to overcome while you're procuring MOSIP yourself?
Just to piggyback on the previous response from Rene, in terms of long-term, imagine right now we're in 2024, we're buying an EBIS product, for example, biometric license. Do you think at the rate at which AI is progressing, the rate at which new technologies are progressing, AI, etc., most probably 2030, there could be an open source EBIS, right? Nothing is forever. Like most of the open source products that we use, all the modules, the building blocks that we use today are probably born in the last 5 years. So obviously, when we do these procurements, technologies change, open source changes. So this perpetual license, nothing is perpetual, right? Just by name, that it's a perpetual license. So when we go for something perpetual, the price has to make sense. If we're buying something perpetual, the price has to make sense. As far as vendor lock-in is concerned, it also goes to this question of perpetual, right? Like you sign an agreement with a system integrator, for example, for 3 years. There needs to be a way out, a clean way out. You don't want to be too dependent on the SI. That 3 years later, you don't know what to do. So obviously the nature of IT, the nature of digital changes very quickly, and procurement has to take that into consideration. Right now, for example, in our case, we're using a database, an open source database, Postgres, but clustering it, we don't have the skills for it. So we're having to hire a database SI just for Postgres. But when we hire this database SI, we want to make sure that once they're out, it's a 1-year contract, once they're out, we want to retain some of the skills because we don't want to keep paying them every year. So we put that into the contract, into the RFP, that whatever support they give us, some of the deliverable also has to include capacity building of our database admins.
Yeah, I think that's a really valid point, is making sure that you're building that kind of thing into your terms of reference when you're acquiring a new vendor. And Jasper, I think as well with open source, there can be concerns about the cost, and actually it's sort of the reverse thinking to what we're thinking. Because open source code itself is free, but there is still a cost to implementation, but often lower over time. Does that sometimes lead to concerns about the quality of the open source product? And is there a lack of trust in open source technology in your experience?
as a government in Sierra Leone, when considering whether we should procure proprietary solutions or go with open source, we ask, where does the cost lie? That's the first question we ask. Where does the cost lie? Mostly we don't pay for the code, right, with proprietary solutions. It's not, the code isn't where the bulk of the cost is. It's in customization, implementation, maintenance, and support. But those four costs also apply to open source solutions, just at a lower rate. So for resource-constrained countries like Sierra Leone, that's why we appreciate not-for-profit organizations like MOSIP, like DPG Alliance, which would then provide technical support for our teams within government agencies. And on quality, I think the very nature of open source solutions, at the very core of open source is the principle of what the Japanese call Kaizen, continuous improvement, because the codes are out there and there are development community that can update this code, fix bugs, make comments to them, review them. So it's continuous improvement that's at the bedrock of open source solutions. So in the long run, open source shouldn't be, the quality of open source solutions shouldn't be a problem because it fixes itself organically over time. While with proprietary solutions, you have to go back to the vendor, and then the vendor lock-in is a real problem. I can give a specific example in Sierra Leone. Our national ID program, right? When it was first implemented, we outsourced the development to a foreign company. We've been facing so many challenges. Now we have in MOSIP models. We're migrating our program onto MOSIP models, and it's going on smoothly. OpenG2P was originated in Sierra Leone. We developed the first version of it. The impact was amazing. We used it for safety net payments to nurses and health workers during the Ebola epidemic and during the COVID epidemic. Cost was never a problem, and quality was never a problem, because we kept on developing the versions, and with MOSIP taking over OpenG2P as a sister organization, there have been several iterations of versions, and it's becoming way better over time. So it's almost obvious that open source is of a better quality in the long run than proprietary solutions. And the cost will, of course, still remain on maintenance, customization, support, and implementation.
And Kamya, that's an interesting point as well, in that, like, just because a country may have implemented a proprietary solution doesn't mean that open source is off the table. So what are different ways that countries can use open source in their DPI alongside some of those proprietary solutions?
Yeah, John, I think that's, sorry. Yeah, I think it's a great question, because I think countries often think that it's like mutually exclusive, like, do I use open source or do I use a proprietary solution? The reality is, even if you're deploying open source, you still need a system integrator or sort of a service provider who will offer you some private services. And even if you're going full private services, odds are they're using open source projects to give you those private services. So you mentioned Postgres or Kafka. Most system integrators, even if they're giving you a vendor-specific solution, they would reuse those. And the reason is because those have been scale tested. So why would you try to build your own code for something that's been tested at scale, like across multiple countries, contexts, and conditions? So I think, first of all, we should not be in the mode of saying, okay, do I use open source or not? The reality is, for good quality, you will end up using some open source or the other. Question is how much, right? And so therefore, I think even when building DPI, and we often face this question, in some of the G20 conversations, et cetera, is like, what is the difference between DPIs and DPGs? Do you have to use a DPG to build a DPI and vice versa? They're actually sort of orthogonal, but extremely complementary, right? So you can build, if you want, a digital public infrastructure entirely from scratch without using any open source. That's an option that's available to you. However, as you've kind of mentioned, if you use a DPG or a combination of multiple DPGs, you'll move faster, you'll end up being slightly cheaper, And your likelihood for scale will be slightly better because the code has been battle tested, right? And it's been sort of contributed to by global developers. Usually, these open source projects, unlike governments that sometimes struggle to cross borders, developers cross borders very easily. So they all end up contributing, to a global project. So I think the reality is that even if you don't choose to deploy open source, even if you're going fully private service provider, you should make sure that you tell your vendor to check it against the open source solution, make sure it's as good and covers as many of the features as possible if there is a good open source project, right? If not, to reuse that code, to at least use it as a reference, right? So I think there's many ways in which the open source contributions in this space have added tremendous value, not only from their adoptions, but from their references across different contexts. And I think in the DPI space, we're very fortunate to have a lot of open source projects. And a lot of spaces don't have this. So that's one silver lining, I would say.
And I guess that comes down to an understanding of what you're procuring as well, right? And in particular, licenses. And how important is understanding those software licenses when you're implementing any given solution in terms of interoperability and that kind of like long-term sustainability and interoperability of your solution?
Yeah, look, I think there's a couple of brand names and licenses, and you can kind of shorthand based on that. But like if there's an MIT Apache license, you're like, okay, great, that sounds good. If they're on a DPG registry, you can shortlist based on that. I think license is just one way of building trust in an open source. I think the certification approach is one, where you say, okay, has this open source project been certified by certain agencies? But I would say licensing or checking the licensing is necessary, not sufficient to completely evaluate an open source project when you decide to take it on. As I said, always check if it's been battle tested. Has it scaled? And to what degree, and what extent, and in which contexts? I think both of those together. But I'm curious if others had thoughts on the licensing. They should come in based on their battle scars on testing these. Any thoughts?
Okay, from the Philippine experience, actually, to be honest, we've never actually thought about, how, for instance, MOSIP, if we adopt it, and knowing they're using MPL 2.0 and the Mozilla public license, how will this actually affect our operations and implementation? So what I'm saying is, while we like the concept of open source, well, from our perspective, the licensing scheme didn't seem to be a big factor in our decision. if anything, it did not, become part of the conversation when we were discussing it.
Is that something in retrospect you might think about now?
Possibly now,
Yeah.
now that I know better, but I seem to remember it wasn't really, discussed.
Yeah. Absolutely, fair enough. And sort of coming back to the interoperability question, and Jasper, when it came to that, when it comes to any kind of implementation, do you sort of take into account any kind of technical debt that might exist in that legacy architecture? As you were saying, when you're implementing MOSIP, there was sort of an existing solution. Is that something that you were accounting for when you were procuring MOSIP or any other new technology?
Yes, because as a government, we have certain designated agencies dedicated to providing technical support in the procurement of tech solutions. So yes, we do consider the architecture design, we consider interoperability, integration with existing systems. Yes, those are all at the core of our evaluation in procurement.
Yodahe, is that something that resonates with you as well, as you're looking to continue to grow out your implementation, especially with FADA? Is there any kind of like technical debt that you've had to account for in your rollout, or have you been lucky enough to start with a clean slate?
Technical debt? Interesting term.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, no, for instance, look, Rene was mentioning, they mentioned MOSIP. The SI has to have some kind of proposal related to MOSIP, right? With our SI, which is an active, we're about to publish it, our approach is The MOSIP development, we want to keep it in-house because we've been doing it for the past 3 and something years. We feel comfortable, but the scale-up, which the cloud part, like serving a nation of 100+ million people, we may receive millions of authentication requests every day. We don't have the top-of-the-line cloud engineers around. So most of our focus for the SI is infrastructure and the managed services on top of that infrastructure. So when we go for the RFP, we're not really concerned about the specific technology stack, but the scale-up bit.
Yeah, I think, just if I can comment on this, I think like it's very hard to find systems today that are pure greenfield in any sector, right? So you're always going to see some degree of sort of hangover from a previous system. I think the question you should always ask again is, how much has that system scaled to solve our purposes and needs? And if there is an open source solution or a set of open specifications that you could adopt that might actually scale up, it might be worth treating it as a sunk cost that you should shed and not something that you should strive to fully integrate with the new modules if you think the new module is going to scale like 5x to what your technical debt was. So I think that's one sort of principle. And a second one, I think, is to think of open source also, I think, as a complementary building block to many existing systems. I think, again, going back to the last question, I think many people think you either have to procure your entire system through open source or not use it at all. And in fact, we've spoken to 2 countries who I won't name, but you originally were saying we won't want to use open source. We'd go through our regular procurement, we'll get a vendor, etc. And then like a few years into their journey, they said, oh, by the way, we want this one module that, this is available on this project, and we'll just complement it onto our, proprietary solution. So I think that mix and match is very important, and typically with open source, because it's based on open specs, usually as well, it's not that hard to integrate with sort of a legacy system, especially if it's a complementary module. Yeah.
Can I add to this? All right, that's actually very interesting because I was trying to connect two important topics here, like what he mentioned about continuous improvement and scale up, and trying to connect this to making sure that when we come up with the terms of reference, those 2 concepts are actually explicitly stated there. And it's because because we always want the best of something, right? Whether that's open source or proprietary solution. And so the problem with, coming up with a procurement is, predicting stuff down the road. And because you need to plan properly, come up with a proper budget. And because we're coming from 2 different sides of the fence. From a country's perspective, we want best value for money. We want the best solution out there for whatever we want to procure. But from the SI's perspective, they want to literally see the bottom line, right? And so we're coming from different sides of the fence here. But you know me, I always come from the side of getting the best value for money. And so talking about continuous improvement and scale up, my suggestion for those who are coming up with terms of reference is put in some provisions there that actually accounts for that. If you want continuous improvement, for instance, again, talking about MOSIP, MOSIP comes up with newer versions, right? They'll definitely come up with newer versions. And if you want to get the greatest, latest, best version of MOSIP and make sure that you get that in the current contract, put that there, that, put a provision there. Oh, there's a new version coming up. Make sure we will get that. And obviously there's some cost involved, so you need to factor that in. And because even when you get the latest MOSIP, I suppose you can, it's supposed to promise scaling up and all that stuff. And so, just a suggestion when you're coming with these terms of references and all, you want the best options and best value for money for that. Make sure you put that there. Don't forget.
Jump on in.
Yeah, no, another important pitfall to avoid in public procurements. See, there's always a middleman, right? The OEM, there is the OEM, and there's usually a middleman that bids for the project. Oftentimes, it could be 2-3 other middlemen between the OEM and the bidder. Sometimes they make deals behind closed doors that we're not aware of. And the bidder tells the OEM that you cannot ever work with this client if you want to, once we win this project. So sometime down the line, 3 years later, you want to work with the OEM, their hands are tied. So a good principle another country also told us is whatever the proposal in the bid, whatever the bidder has not disclosed, any kind of backroom deals will not be applicable. You have to put it in the bid document. That's a lot of countries are suffering from it, and I'm not going to name names, but a few countries also passed this advice to us.
Jump on in. Yeah.
I mean, as a country, being a founding board member of the DPG Alliance, those standards actually guide how we move forward with procuring tech solutions in Sierra Leone. So even when we go out to procure proprietary solutions, we want to make sure that the spirit is open, because the future is open. The future is every solution would eventually be open. So we want to make sure, as a sustainability assurance, the tool that we procure meets, at a minimum, some DPGA standards.
I think last comment I'll make before I hand it back to you, I think you can think about open source projects as like the notes from the smartest kid in your class, right? Because you can make your own notes, for sure. I mean, it does give you more control over your notes. You can you can change your notes, but don't you want to see the notes from the smartest kid in your class? So I feel like you don't have to copy them. You can take their permission with a license and use the notes. But I think that's kind of the way to think about open source, is rather than saying, oh, it's some community effort, and because it's not a private capitalistic effort, it's not the best quality. No. Open source is, all of the best engineers at Google, Microsoft, Amazon are all doing open source projects in their free time. So who do you want building the code that's going to run your national system? I think that's kind of the way to formulate it, I would. Yeah.
And Jasper, very good shout out to the DPG standard there. Really appreciate that. I think that's an extra sign of quality, an extra check mark on top of that. I've just seen we're very short on time. We've probably got time for a couple of questions from the audience. For our panel, so put your hand up and we'll get your microphone.
Hello, I'm Bayo from Sierra Leone. I have a question for you. Yeah. You mentioned about DPG, and you mentioned that you can build DPG without open source, so DPIs without open source. That kind of, my idea of DPGs is kind of shattered now, because I thought DPGs are built with combination of open source tools. So DPIs, are built with combination of open source tools or combination of DPGs. So how will it look like when the idea of DPIs is supposed to be open and shareable, and if it's built with non-open source components, how would that work in terms of making it a public good?
No, it's a great question. Do you want to collect a few questions, or it's okay to answer? Yeah. Okay, sure. Sure, I was just checking. Protocol. So the key thing about what makes something an infrastructure, right? Like you're asking about a road. In a way, you're saying, okay, what makes the road a road is that someone's able to use the road, right? What makes the road a road is not where you got the cement. You can get cement from anywhere, as long as it's cement that builds the road. So the way to think about it is that open source is a valuable tool to fast track your cement, but what makes it a DPI is the fact that it's reusable by other people in your economy at the end, right? And it triggers that private innovation. So open specifications is not the same thing as open source. So open source means your whole system is based on code that was published openly, and you've redeployed it in this context. Open standard or open specification means that the plug sitting at the top of that system is a universal adapter that anyone can plug into regardless of their kind of system. And if you've published open APIs or you've used open specs, that helps you become a DPI. And open source helps you build a DPI faster. Hopefully that answers. I don't know if anyone else wants to come in here as well.
We'll get one more question because we are very, very short on time. There we go.
Thank you. My name is Emmanuel from Malawi government. So my question is going to Sierra Leone and Philippines. Over Philippines, you gave a brief description of how you adopted MOSIP. While Sierra Leone, you also gave a scenario where you were already working on a proprietary system, but you also started adopting the open source system. So my question is, what were some of the problems that you encountered and how did you overcome them?
Your question is, what challenges we faced when adopting MOSIP?
Okay. You gave a scenario where you were already working on a proprietary system, yes, and you started adopting open source system.
Yes,
yeah.
Thank you, that's a good question. So what I was saying is, our national ID program, when we started it a few years ago, we outsourced the development. But then we had to keep paying licensing fees, maintenance fees annually, and it was costly. It wasn't sustainable. So, in fact, the gentleman sitting very close to you can answer this question better. VB, he works at the agency. Yeah, please give him the mic. There's a mic, yeah.
I think we'll have a discussion later on that.
So because MOSIP is modular, it's a smooth transition. So we are migrating per model. There isn't much challenges that we're facing now. You see, this again brings up the issue about the design of the contract, right? What exit clauses do you put in contracts that you sign with proprietary service providers? What's the force majeure? What's the sustainability? The trend now is that for resource-constrained countries like ours, even financial distress is now considered a force majeure. It's a reason for us to abandon a proprietary ICT service provider and not continue with their service. So sustainability has been a problem because we keep paying for license and paying for maintenance fees, and there hasn't been much challenges with migrating onto MOSIP at all. It's an amazing experience.
Right,
Yeah.
thanks so much. That's really good to hear. We are totally out of time, but are there any more burning questions, or shall we say thanks? All right, I hope you can join me in a round of applause to thank our amazing panelists today. Thanks so much. And everybody will be available for more questions after the session over a drink at the reception. Thank you so much for joining us today.